So I'll try to give a quick summary of what we've been saying so far about the Common European Framework. The framework proceeds in stages. We've looked in some detail at the first 3 stages of listening comprehension A1 to B1, and we found that this apparently is rather teacher-centered and unnatural. The mindset behind it seems to be that the learner needs to be able to recognize words rather than meaning. It says, for instance, I can recognize familiar words and very basic phrases, or I can understand phrases and the highest frequency vocabulary. So apparently this is all about the ability to extract words that you already know, rather than being able to understand a connected piece of text or a connected piece of discourse. Personal interest appears to play a role only at the first few stages. At the later stages, there's an exclusive focus on factual texts. So fiction or radio plays or theatre or YouTube videos or tweets don't seem to come into it. Also, there's no content on the target cultures, we might say. Nothing is said about what is to be learned in terms of cultural content. So all of this is slightly problematic in the sense that what we need as language learners is not words, but constructions. We speak and listen in constructions. And also we should not aim for differences in quality. So we shouldn't aim as teachers to speak particularly slowly and clearly, but rather for differences in quantity. So providing less than a native speaker would provide, but providing it at the same speed if possible. So although it's clear that the Common European Framework is clearly communicative and action-oriented, and stresses interaction and mediation, this is not entirely new in the 2000s, of course. It's something that was already initiated in the 1970s by the communicative approach, but also even before then in the 1900s by the backlash against traditional grammar teaching that was the reform movement. Still, a number of criticisms need to be raised against the Common European Framework. We've just looked at the listening comprehension descriptors, and what they suggest is that students will only be confronted with real-life language at the final stages of their language learning career, if you like. So the formulations that we find in the CEFR will probably foster a kind of teaching that is not very likely to allow students to communicate right from the beginning. So in actual fact, the framework turns out to be not as communicative as it's made out to be. Also, if you abstract away from all the gobbledygook, you can see the CEFR for what it really is. It's a description of what people can do with language, but basically what people can do with any language. It describes universal empty shells that need to be filled with actual language material. We might ask, where's the flesh, where's the beef? And that's something, of course, that the makers of the CEFR also realized after a while, and they then fleshed out the framework with vocabulary. So there's a general mix-up of categories here, a mix-up between linguistic abilities and cognitive abilities. some learners, or most learners, will already have cognitive abilities, thinking abilities, the ability to argue, the ability to inference, even though they are beginners in a language, beginners in learning Portuguese, for instance. So the complexity of the language that we present them with must correspond to their intellectual level rather than some sort of universal competence, universal linguistic empty shell competence, you might say. What we need to learn is constructions and language games in the foreign language. We do not need to learn or relearn cognitive abilities. What's also problematic is, as we've seen, that the framework is mainly about informative texts. It's about information, but it excludes thought processes, which obviously is one thing that language is for. It's not just about everyday communication. It's not just about culling information from texts. It is also about the ability to think critically, critical thinking skills. So the term kritische Diskursfähigkeit that Hallett uses, for instance, might be more appropriate to describe the aims of real language teaching rather than competence. The makers of the CEFR realized that it's simply not good enough to provide learners with empty shells, and that we do need vocabulary and we do need grammar. And individual countries then came up with English, German, and French profiles, for instance, to flesh out the framework with vocabulary at least. So this has been done in some detail now for English, for instance, and it's available from Cambridge University Press, the English vocabulary profile online, which categorizes vocabulary by topics, but primarily, of course, by the various levels of the Common European Framework. So all the words and phrases you need for level A1, at least supposedly. Of course, this is also always open to criticism, and it's difficult to classify language in this way. Okay. In a way, this is a continuation of an older project that was called the Threshold Level, which was part of the early communicative approach, a notional functional approach, and the threshold level aimed to provide the material that you need to meet particular language functions, to perform particular language functions. So if we take this criticism a little further, we end up with what we might call the Duolingo paradox. Most of you will have heard of the Duolingo app, which has enabled millions of learners to learn new languages of their choice. And Duolingo basically uses the same kind of material that we find in the threshold level or the English profile, for instance, or the French or the German profile for that matter. So basically units of the word type, and it uses these units in very simplistic sentences that you would also find in Chomskyan grammar, for instance. So sentences that are pretty unnatural, that do not occur in real life, but apparently even sentences of this type still enable learners to make quite considerable progress in a foreign language. Now, if we were able to provide these apps like Duolingo with natural sounding constructions rather than words, using, for instance, the kind of lexico-grammar that Christa Segerman has developed, and which you can see in this slide, then we'd be able to teach language far more efficiently. So as you can see, this lexico-grammar combines content, particular concepts such as achievement, with the linguistic building blocks that you need to express these concepts in natural French in this case. So for instance, achievement can be expressed by using a pronominal verb block, as she calls it, plus a predicative block, plus what she calls a circumstantial block. So you get things like tu es bon en allemand, vous êtes fort en art plastique, and so on. This is the kind of thinking we also need in the teaching of English, and it would also be the kind of unit that we need to provide learners with in apps like Duolingo to So as the CFI itself states, there's no need to follow it. It's a tool that we can use to facilitate language teaching in some respects, but the authors explicitly state